and for me, okay. Today, is space the next military battleground? We're discussing what a galactic arms race would mean for the planet. Join the conversation. Tweet us or leave a comment in our live YouTube chat. And if it's good, you could be in the stream. The popular US television show Star Trek may have been right when it declared space the final frontier. This week, officials from 25 countries are meeting in Switzerland in an effort to prevent a military conflict from breaking out in space. The closed-door talks are seen as a test of goodwill, but if all 25 countries do not agree, then the treaty won't be formalised. Joining us to talk about this, in Sapporo, Japan, Kazuto Suzuki. He's a member of the International Editorial Board at the Space Policy Journal. In Geneva, Switzerland, Daniel Porras. He's a Space Security Fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. And in the studio, Victoria Sampson. She's the Washington Office Director for the Secure World Foundation. Hello, everybody. It's really good to have you. Certainly as a member of the public and a civilian, when we talk about the militarization of space, we think sci-fi and explosions and battles. But I really want to get down to the nitty-gritty of the reality. What are the conflicts? Have there been any in space that you know about?
I mean, it's not that sexy, unfortunately. And everyone always thinks, you're going to have Starship Troopers coming around and, dogfights in space. But really what we're looking at is interfering with satellites. Okay. And that can be anything from deliberately shooting one down. But what's happening now is actually just jamming, radio frequency interference, preventing the satellite broadcast emissions from getting to their targeted audience.
Who's at war with which entity or which country right now or recently that you can tell us about?
Well, I think there are not so much enemies as in potential threats. And frankly, and my colleagues can definitely interrupt me if they disagree, but I think right now the United States, China, and Russia are obviously keeping an eye on what each other's doing.
Kazuto, are they jamming each other? What are they doing?
Well, they can jam each other, but they don't necessarily do that all the time. The point is that you can jam the signals from satellites towards this satellite, but also you can jam locally. For example, the North Korea has jammed GPS signals around the border with South Korea. So that makes it very hard for the airplanes and cars to run around. So that sort of disruption
That's
can be
really
caused by
serious. So would that ground planes, or would it just be incredibly inconvenient?
It makes it very inconvenient, and often the case that those airports have to be shut down because of that interference. And you can create all sorts of civil economic disruptions by interfering the satellite signals.
Daniel, it sounds more like mischief than war.
Well, at the moment, while we do have certain levels of mischief, we are already seeing that because space assets and space systems are so important for the military these days, various countries are trying to find ways to negate some of those capabilities. It's just a simple way of trying to neutralize the field and to gain an advantage over a rival. Our biggest concern at the moment is that while we haven't seen conflict break out in space yet, the potential for escalatory situation is there. So we don't want the situation to get any worse. And we certainly know that, as Victoria said, the US, Russia, China, and maybe some other players are also trying to develop new capabilities that could be a lot more disruptive or potentially destructive. And of course, one of the big concerns that we have is that when you have destructive capabilities in space, you make a lot of trash. And the trash doesn't come down, it stays in orbit and could potentially render some of our orbits unusable in the future.
Victoria?
Right. I mean, just building off Daniel's thought, I mean, people think of space debris and they think maybe of the movie WALL-E, where eventually there's going to be a ring of trash circling the planet and it's eventually the rockets are going to have to pop out through the circuit. That's not what we have to worry about. What we have to worry about is that at a certain point, it's going to be too costly to use certain orbits. And certain orbits or altitudes are very useful for very specific tasks on Earth. And so that means we lose those capabilities.
We're also surrounded by a ton of trash that's just circulating, so it may even just bump into satellites that we're using for everyday use as well.
That actually happened in 2009. An old Russian satellite bumped into an active U.S. satellite.
Sure.
Right now, it's called space situational awareness, and there are organizations that are tracking this sort of thing, but it's difficult because if you have a piece of trash or debris approaching an active satellite, you can call the satellite owner and say, hey, you got to move this.
Yeah.
But if you have two pieces of debris approaching each other, what are you going to do?
Exactly.
You know, neither one of them can move.
Cassuto, you broke it down for us about the possibilities of the kind of warfare or military conflict that can be had in space. You broke it down, and then we made a very simple animation just to talk people through. Let's start with the first option. So the first option is a space-based weapon, so a satellite shooting another satellite. Tell us more about that. What's possible there?
Well, satellite can shoot at a satellite, but most likely that you can approach to the other satellite and take them down together. So it's like a suicidal.
Oh, just crash into it.
Yeah, you can crash into it, or you can take down to the, go together in the orbit, or you don't have to, destroy a satellite. You can just disable the satellite. You can, give the some electronic pulse to disable the some communication devices or antennas.
Daniel was grinning. Daniel, why are you grinning?
Well, this is I suppose I'm just grinning because these are some of the issues that we're dealing with on a daily basis, and as people are developing these technologies, some of it is useful. Some of the technologies like on-orbit service vehicles, which are like little maneuverable satellites that can approach other objects. This technology is intended to help clean up debris or potentially to extend the life of the satellite.
Right.
However, at the moment, because of the sort of the situation between some of the big powers in the world, there's a lack of trust.
Yeah.
And so
So we automatically think the worst case scenario, not, hey, it's great that we can maneuver these satellites close to each other. We're always thinking they're going to crash them and take them down. All right, another option, possibility about militarization in space is ground to space. So something happening down on the ground, shooting satellites in space. Cassuto, tell us more about that.
Yeah.
Does that happen? Can that happen?
Well, it happened in 2007 that China demonstrated the capability of shooting down the satellite from the ground by using a missile. And any, let's say, missile defense capabilities can do that for the low Earth orbit for sure. So if you are having a satellite in a closer region to Earth, then it can be targeted by the missiles, which are designed to shoot down, another incoming missile, but also you can take down the satellite as well.
Cassuto mentioned the 2007 Chinese anti-satellite test. Actually, the United States did one in 2008, where we used a modified interceptor from our missile defense system to shoot down a
I'm
US
pretending
satellite.
that I know every single word you just said there, and I'm nodding, but I don't really. Do you want to explain that in layman's terms
Absolutely.
or laywoman's terms?
Yeah, there you go, layperson's. So the United States used an interceptor, basically a rocket that's intended to run into something else,
Right.
To shoot down one of its own satellites, and it took it from our ballistic missile defense program, the idea that we're trying to intercept an incoming rocket, bullet with a bullet.
Yeah.
And in theory, missile defense is supposed to just intercept rockets and not supposed to hit satellites.
Yeah, yeah.
But in 2008, we launched an intelligence satellite that didn't go where
the
United States.
Yeah.
The United States launched an intelligence satellite that didn't go where they had intended it to go. And they said, well, actually, it has a lot of bad chemicals in it. If it deorbits and we don't know where it lands, that could be very bad for people on the ground. We better shoot it down. And so they did.
And it was successful? First shot, got it?
Got it. They did it at a lower altitude than the Chinese did. The Chinese 2007 anti-satellite test left a lot of debris, pieces of trash in a very active orbit.
Yeah.
The United States in 2008 did it at a lower orbit, so the debris all came back down. The planetary pole can bring the debris down and burns up in the atmosphere.
Okay.
But definitely it is something that has been done.
Right, so many possibilities. One more, which is the space-based missile defense system. Here's the animation, just very quickly. Cassuto, tell us about this.
Well, the missile defense will be very effective if it's done in an early stage. So when the missile was launched from somewhere else and it's incoming, then it's better to shoot down in space rather than it's coming down to you. So the United States proposed the idea to shoot down the incoming missile in space based on using the space-based satellites or space-based weapons. The problem is that you never know when the missile is incoming, and in order to prepare to shoot down those missiles, you have to have thousands and thousands of satellites to shoot them down, and which is very, very expensive, and it's economically unfeasible. So it's not there yet, and it's not gonna. I don't think it's gonna happen.
Daniel, go ahead, Daniel.
Sorry, I was just going to add on to what Kazuto was saying.
Yeah.
One of the big problems with space-based missile defense is that one, it creates the potential for not just being able to intercept missiles, but as Victoria was saying earlier, missile interceptors can have a variety of uses. And so a number of other countries are very concerned that space-based missile interceptors might not be used for missile interceptors at all, but rather to try and strike targets on the ground.
Right.
So that in turn causes other actors to say, hey, if the United States are thinking about putting missiles in space, we need to be able to destroy those missiles. And so they continue to develop their own capabilities to shoot down satellites or platforms in space.
So that's the potential of what's possible in terms of militarization. We are live on YouTube right now, Victoria. I got this YouTube comment in. Space is in international waters, or international space, I think they mean to say. It's for everyone. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think that's a agreed upon concept. When they signed the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, that was one of the tenets, is that space is available to everyone for peaceful uses. Everyone has a right to it and has the ability to utilize it. But the concern is it's a shared domain. So the actions of one country or entity or satellite operator can affect the ability of everyone to use it.
Yeah. Daniel, this one, go ahead.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, please.
And I think one of the most important aspects of thinking about the militarization of space is that you can't put other people out from space. If you want to launch satellite, then you have the right to do so, and it's more than international water. International water, you can territorially prevent that someone is coming, but in space, you can't really stop someone, orbiting the satellite around you. So, it's really hard to reject the other people to use space, and that's more open, and it's a commons for anyone.
Daniel,
globally.
I want this YouTube comment for you. So Minor talks about space law. What role do you think it will play in preventing countries from militarizing space? That is what you're trying to work on right now, at least a treaty, or at least working out what should go in the treaty.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just make one clarification. There's a difference between the militarization of outer space and the weaponization of outer space.
Okay.
Now, the militarization of outer space, that began from the moment that human beings started conducting space activities. And that means that the military uses space to augment certain services. So, for example, they have satellites that they can use for telecommunications between troops. They have satellites that facilitate targeting. They have satellites for reconnaissance. So, in a sense, the militarization of outer space has already happened and has been happening for a long time. Right. In fact, those services are considered to be in accordance with the Outer Space Treaty. Now, the weaponization of outer space is the concept that people will start developing capabilities to do attacks or hostile actions in outer space and potentially striking some of the satellites that we have in orbit. So what we're trying to work on right now is it's an agenda item that the United Nations has been looking for about 40 years, so actually longer than I've been alive, for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And that's where we think that there aren't any provisions in the existing space law that speak directly to, for example, the deployment of space-based missile interceptors. The Outer Space Treaty that we have, which has been around since 1967, the only thing that it prohibits is the placement of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in outer space. So we're concerned about other things that might get put in space or used in outer space. And so that's what we're trying to work out now.
How's it going? Is there any drama yet?
Oh, there's
Daniel,
always
you're,
drama
you're,
behind
you're
this
there.
topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's always drama behind this topic. But one of the great things that's happening now is that we see so much investment in space, and our dependency on space and space systems is becoming much greater. So I think a lot of leaders around the world are starting to realize that we really cannot afford to have open conflict in space that could potentially shut down some of these systems. And it would impact us in ways that we don't necessarily think about. So for example, financial transactions are dependent on GPS because they have to have a time signature that specifies a very precise hour or a very precise moment when the financial transactions take place. If something were to happen to the GPS network, it could be potentially catastrophic, and not just necessarily in space, but for everyone down here on Earth.
Don't think I didn't notice when I asked you about drama, you didn't actually mention any particular countries. For instance, I understand that China is perhaps out of step with some of the other countries. What are the areas that you're wrestling with right now? Because to get everybody on board, correct me, I'm not there, you're there, Daniel, but to get everybody on board, everybody has to agree to this. It can't be 24 countries or 23, it has to be all 25.
Well, actually, if we could just get certain players, certain big players to agree on some of these things, we would probably be okay. But because we are the United Nations and we want everyone to be represented, we try to give a voice to people who may not have the technology to conduct war in space, but that they do have an interest in outer space. So, for example, even though countries like Nigeria and Brazil and Argentina don't necessarily have missile defense systems that can destroy satellites, if there were conflict in space, they could still suffer the consequences. So we develop a forum, or we have a forum here, where everyone can voice their concerns and try to come to some kind of an agreement that everyone can be on board with. And it's not easy. Not easy at all. But
he's not telling us anymore. He's not going to tell us how hard it is. Victoria,
yeah, I will say the United Nations discusses space in two different areas. They have the Conference of Disarmament, which is where Daniel is, and then they have the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space.
Yeah.
And that deals with civil space, and that meets in Vienna. Last year, in June of 2018, COPUOS, this committee, agreed to 21 guidelines for the long-term sustainable use of outer space. Now, this was a consensus-driven document, so that meant you had to have every single member of COPUOS had to agree. U.S., Russia, China, Iran, everyone had to agree. So that's a big deal. So it is possible. I have faith, Daniel. I know you can do this.
I'm just thinking, let's be realistic about an idea of a treaty. So everyone has to sign up to it, everyone has to agree to it, and then everyone has to keep to it. Kasuto, is that possible from what we know about the international treaties that exist so far in the world?
Well, we already have an outer space treaty, and I think, as I said, the space is a sort of a global commons. It's for everyone, and everyone is affected. And as Daniel said, that we all depend on the space-based services like GPS for the international financial transactions. So basically, I think there is a common ground for everyone to make sure that space is safe and space is, usable for everybody. So on that point, I think as Victoria mentioned, that there was a 21 points of agreements that can be shared with most of the countries. The problem remains is that because the space is very useful for everyone, then if you shoot down the satellites or if you take out the space capabilities, then you can make a harm for others. And that makes, that sort of stimulates for some countries that we want to maintain the capability of disrupting those services to make other people annoyed or, to make sure that, if they attack us, we can attack them back by disrupting those services. So that sort of security side is where there is a problem. But on the safety side, like, using the space for common goods I think it's there.
I have this suggestion here from Andre. Let me tell you who Andre is. Andre is the US-Russian Relations and Middle East at PIR Center, and he's also a co-host as well. So he knows a lot about what we've been talking about. Here's his suggestion, Victoria. Non-first deployment is an idea that if everyone pledges not to be the first to put weapons in space and then sticks to it, there will be no weapons in space, even without a legally binding treaty. Though again, the US doesn't seem interested.
Yeah, so that's a very
that was a little
Russian
dig there at the end.
point.
Yeah,
the Russians have been pushing that for some time.
So no treaty. Let's just say nobody's going to put anything
Well, I mean,
up there.
you could always do a unilateral action. No one's stopping any country from saying that. I think one of the criticisms of the Russian proposal for no first placement is like, why first?
Yeah.
Why not just say no placement if you're really serious? It seems I've heard people from the Western Bloc say Russia isn't serious when they propose this. They're more doing it to make everyone look bad because they know there's no way the Western Bloc's going to sign on, and they don't have to actually do anything about it. If Russia were serious, Russia is totally capable of saying, you know, we're just going to do it unilaterally. We're going to decide no placement of weapons in space. But they have not decided that. They have not said that.
Well, in addition to that, there is a problem of definition of what is space weapon. Because space weapon, you can put the missiles in the space, or you can have a radar, but any space objects or satellites can turn into weapons. So it is rather difficult to define what space weapon means. And yes, you can say, I'm not going to put the missiles or radar in space, but well, if push comes to shove, then I can I can put my satellite bump into another satellite. So that can be a weapon. Well, technically, it's possible.
This is
if I can follow up on that as well.
Yes, Daniel, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, another problem that creates is that because we cannot define what a space weapon is, we also can't necessarily verify that people are abiding by any agreements that we might come to. So this is actually something that I'm looking into at the moment, which is what are our capabilities for verifying certain compliance with obligations in space. And unfortunately, because things are in outer space, it's very difficult to tell if someone puts up a satellite, what are its capabilities? Yeah. What can it do? What can it not do? And it's very difficult to determine. And really, at the moment, very few countries might have even the potential to be able to determine that, let alone to share it with others. So part of the challenges that we're facing here at the United Nations is trying to figure out, if we do come to some kind of an agreement, how do we even verify that people are complying with it?
In addition to that, I think there is a problem of defining or identifying the intention. Okay, one satellite is hitting another satellite. Is it because of an accident, or is it because of a deliberate move to attack on the other satellite? So that's another issue of verifying it and identifying the intent.
Here's a comment from Charles. Victoria, what about nuclear non-armament treaties as a model? If most spacefaring nations sign on, could it have a coercive effect on Russia, China, and the US to play nice?
I mean, the problem with treaties for space is that basically, as Kazuto said, it's hard to define what you want to do. I used to work in nuclear issues, and what disarmament people do is that you want people to have a capability, you just ban it. You say, okay, we want people to have nuclear weapons, no fissile material for you. But with space, it's hard because what are you going to ban? The technology is a technology. It's the intent. It's what you're doing with it that's threatening. And so there's a real debate in the international community. Do you try to have norms about behavior, or do you try and ban technology? Frankly, I think it's more beneficial to talk about norms of behavior and try and look at, okay, what is a responsible space actor going to be doing? And that actually allows you to stop having the same argument we've been having for decades now.
Sorry, and this might be one of the few times that I disagree with Victoria. But I do think that
Daniel, this is the last line in the show. Make it count. It's a short sentence. Go for it.
There are other options for a treaty. So, for example, one option that I've been thinking about for a while now is, why not have a treaty on preventing certain types of use of force in outer space?
Okay.
So people can defend themselves in space, But what if we at least agree, the same way that we agree that some types of weapons, like biological weapons or chemical weapons, are so terrible that we never want to resort to them?
Thank you.
What if we also
Daniel
say something
Porras,
to the effect
ending on a positive suggestion, an alternative treaty. Kazuto Suzuki and Victoria Sampson, thank you so very much for talking about the militarization of space here on The Stream. See you next time.